My name is Grace, I'm 27 years old, and this is the story of how I built a life they never thought I deserved. It was Thanksgiving, and the air in my parents' house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and cruelty. My mother's voice, sharp and thin, cut through the warm, buttery chatter of the dining room. "You'll never own a house like your sister, Grace." She said it with a laugh, as if she were telling a light-hearted joke, but her eyes were cold. The laughter that followed from around the table was soft, but it was sharp enough to draw blood. My older sister, Victoria, the golden daughter, the pride of the family, took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine and smirked at me over the rim of the glass. "Come on, Mom, don't make her feel bad," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Not everyone's meant for stability. Some people are just free spirits." Everyone laughed again, a little louder this time. My dad chuckled into his mashed potatoes. My uncle nodded in agreement. Even my sweet, tired grandma managed a weak smile, not wanting to disrupt the family's favorite pastime, reminding me of my place. I smiled too. I held my fork, looked at each of them, and I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing my skin, but because for the very first time, I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend myself, because while they were all sitting there, mocking me for not having a home, I was already designing one in perfect, blissful silence. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Victoria wasn't just the golden child. She was the sun around which my entire family happily orbited. Her gravity was immense, pulling all attention, all praise, all expectations toward her. I was born 2 years later, not as a new center of a universe, but as a small, forgotten moon, reflecting her light and existing mostly in her shadow. From our earliest days, the dynamic was set. When Victoria took her first steps, my parents filmed it, framed photos of it, and told the story at every subsequent family gathering. When I took mine, my mother was on the phone, coordinating Victoria's first playdate. Her successes were never just hers. They were family trophies, polished and displayed for all to see. I remember her high school graduation party with a painful clarity. Our backyard was transformed, filled with white tents, catered food, and at least 100 guests. My mother floated through the crowd, a radiant queen mother, carrying a leather-bound album filled with every certificate and award Victoria had ever received. "This is her debate team championship," she'd announced to a cluster of neighbors. And here she is, accepting the science fair prize. She built a working volcano that actually erupted with baking soda. So clever. I had just finished my sophomore year of high school and had recently won a regional award for a digital art piece I'd spent months creating. It was the first time I had ever been recognized for my talent. The first time I felt a spark of genuine pride in my own abilities. The small, heavy plaque was wrapped in a towel in the backseat of my car. All afternoon, I tried to find the right moment to mention it. I'd approach my mom, my heart thumping, only to have her turn away to greet a new guest or rush off to direct the catering staff. Finally, late in the evening, I found her alone for a moment near the dessert table. "Mom?" I started, my voice small. "I have something to show you. It's the art award I won." She was straightening a stack of napkins, her focus elsewhere. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her eyes scanning the yard. "Can you believe how many people came for Vicky? It's just wonderful. Now, be a doll and see if your Uncle Robert needs another drink. He looks thirsty." The conversation was over. The moment was gone. I spent the rest of the party in my self-assigned role, the helper, the ghost, the quiet stagehand in the grand production of my sister's life. The plaque stayed in the car. Victoria's adult life was simply an extension of this lifelong performance. She married Mark, a man who seemed less like a person and more like a collection of desirable attributes. He was a dentist, he drove a luxury sedan, he had a firm handshake, and his teeth were so brilliantly white they were practically a landmark. At their wedding, my father's toast was less about his daughter's happiness and more about his pride in her excellent choice. "Victoria always had the best taste," he'd boomed, raising his champagne flute. "She's brought a wonderful, successful man into our family." Their house in the gated community of Willow Creek was the ultimate trophy. It was a sprawling, sterile monument to their success. I visited once for a housewarming party. The walls were all painted a tasteful shade of greige. The furniture looked like it had been lifted directly from a magazine cover, and there wasn't a single personal item out of place. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom. My mother walked through the rooms with a reverence usually reserved for a cathedral. She ran her hand over the cold marble of the kitchen island, an island larger than my entire kitchen, and sighed. "This is what it's all about," she'd whispered to my aunt, loud enough for me to hear. "Making a real home, having something to show for your life." She kept a large, professionally taken photo of that house on the mantelpiece in her own home, a daily reminder of what she considered true success. There were no photos of me or my small, cozy apartment. My life, by contrast, was a source of constant, low-grade disappointment. The label of the artsy one was my cross to bear. It was a catch-all term for everything they didn't understand or value about me. My career as a graphic designer was a cute little hobby. My independence was a failure to settle down. My carefully managed budget was a sign that I was struggling. The comparisons were relentless and exhausting. If I bought a new pair of secondhand boots, my mom would ask if I was being responsible with my money. If Victoria bought a new designer handbag, my mom would praise her for investing in quality pieces. If I spent a weekend at home, reading and recharging, my dad would call, worried that I was lonely and isolated. If Victoria and Mark spent a weekend at a spa, they were taking a well-deserved break from their stressful lives. I learned to survive by making myself smaller, quieter. I built a world for myself that they couldn't touch. My apartment was my sanctuary. It was filled with books, plants, and colorful art I'd collected from local thrift stores. It was messy and lived in and real. It was everything Victoria's house wasn't. Here, I wasn't a ghost. I was the master of my own small universe. But every time I had to attend a family function, I had to put on my ghost costume and fade into the background. The thing they never understood was that their constant disregard gave me a unique kind of freedom. Because they had already written me off, they never bothered to look closely. They never saw the late nights I spent teaching myself new design software, the weekends I dedicated to online business courses, or the meticulous spreadsheets I used to track my savings. They saw a free spirit drifting aimlessly through life. They didn't see the architect who was silently, painstakingly drawing up the blueprints for her own escape. Their underestimation wasn't just an insult. It was the perfect camouflage. The drive home from that Thanksgiving dinner should have been 15 minutes. Instead, I sat in my parked car at the curb in front of my parents' house for almost an hour, the engine silent, the November cold slowly seeping through the glass. The house glowed. It was a perfect picture of warmth and family. A Rockwell painting come to life. Laughter would occasionally burst through the walls, a happy, careless sound that made my stomach clench. I could picture the scene perfectly. My dad would be asleep in his recliner, a newspaper over his face. My uncle would be telling a loud, unfunny story, and my mother and Victoria would be in the kitchen, heads close together, sharing a secret or a piece of gossip, their bond a fortress I could never seem to penetrate. My hands were clamped so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. My whole body was trembling, not from the cold, but from a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. It was a sickness I'd been carrying for years, a low-grade fever of resentment that would spike during family holidays. But this time was different. The fever had broken. It wasn't that my mother's comment was the cruelest thing she'd ever said. There had been worse. There was the time she'd told me my art degree was a waste of a good mind, or the time she'd introduced me to a friend as my other daughter, the one who is still finding herself. But the casual, laughing way she'd delivered the line, "You'll never own a house like your sister," and the instant, gleeful smirk on Victoria's face, that combination was the final, crushing blow. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict. It was the closing statement in the lifelong case of Grace versus the family's expectations. And they had found me guilty of being unworthy. A single hot tear finally escaped and traced a path down my cold cheek. I swiped it away with an angry gesture. I was done crying over them. Crying was passive. Crying was what they expected. The shivering in my body wasn't weakness anymore. It was a current of energy, a coiled spring of anger and hurt that was finally ready to snap. Something inside me had hardened. The soft, wounded part of me that always hoped they might one day see me, that they might finally be proud of me, had turned to steel. I didn't want their approval anymore. I wanted to build a life so far beyond their limited imagination that their opinions would become irrelevant, like the buzz of a distant fly. That's when I reached for my laptop. The worn, familiar weight of it in my lap was comforting. I powered it on, the screen's pale light pushing back against the darkness of the car. And there it was, the folder named Someday. It was more than a collection of files. It was a vault where I kept my secret, fragile hope. My fingers, still trembling slightly, moved the cursor and double-clicked. The contents spilled across my screen. I didn't just glance at them. I immersed myself. I opened a subfolder filled with client testimonials. I read an email from a woman who ran a small animal shelter, telling me that the new website I'd designed for her had led to a 50% increase in adoption inquiries. "You have no idea what a difference this has made, Grace. You've helped save lives." I opened another file, a design I'd done for a family-owned coffee shop. It was a beautiful, intricate logo that I had been immensely proud of. They had loved it so much they'd had it painted as a mural on their wall. Then I opened the spreadsheet. It was my secret weapon, the undeniable proof of my hard work. I had meticulously tracked every single dollar I'd ever made from my side projects. The columns and rows told a story of slow, steady growth. The first year I'd made just over $5,000. The next, $18,000. This past year, I was on track to clear $40,000. All of it earned between the hours of 7 p.m. and 2 a.m. All of it sitting in a high-yield savings account they knew nothing about. It was real. It wasn't a hobby. It was a business in waiting. The word whispered itself in the silent car. Someday. And with the force of a revelation, I knew that someday was a lie. It was a postponement. It was a permission slip I was waiting for, one that was never going to come. I didn't need to wait for someday. Someday was now. My fingers moved with a new, sure-footed speed. I pulled up my phone's hotspot, the connection slow but steady. I navigated to the state's official business portal, a bland, bureaucratic website that suddenly felt like the gateway to my entire future. The online form was intimidating, filled with legal terms like sole proprietorship and limited liability company. I paused, my confidence wavering for a second. It felt too big, too real. Then I pictured my mother's laugh, my sister's smirk. My resolve hardened again. I clicked on limited liability company. It sounded safe. It sounded strong. For the business name, I typed in the first thing that came to my mind, the truest thing. Grace Design Co. It was simple. It was mine. My name, my work. My company. I filled in the rest of the information, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I reached the payment page, I saw the fee, $150. It felt like the best money I would ever spend. I pulled out my debit card, the one linked to my secret account, and carefully typed in the 16 digits. My hand hovered over the submit button for a long, breathless moment. This was it, the point of no return. I was stepping out of the shadows. I clicked. For a few seconds, there was just a loading icon, a spinning wheel that seemed to hold my entire future in its digital orbit. Then the page refreshed. A confirmation message appeared in plain black text. Congratulations. Your application for Grace Design Co. LLC has been received and approved. I leaned my head back against the cold headrest and let out a shaky breath that turned into a quiet, tearful laugh. It was done. It was real. In the dark, in the cold, sitting in a 10-year-old car outside a house where I felt like a ghost. I had just brought my new life into existence. The decision made in the cold darkness of my car that night ignited a fire in me. But keeping that fire burning required a level of work and sacrifice I hadn't fully anticipated. My life condensed into a grueling, monotonous, and strangely exhilarating routine. The next 3 years were a blur of screens, deadlines, and cheap coffee. My days were split into 2 distinct lives. From 8 to 5, I was the quiet, reliable Grace at the marketing firm. I did my work. I did it well. But I kept my head down. I was a ghost there too, in a way. I deflected conversations at the water cooler, ate lunch at my desk, and politely declined invitations for after-work drinks. My colleagues probably thought I was shy or antisocial. The truth was, I was conserving every ounce of my mental and social energy for my second life, the one that began the moment I walked through the door of my apartment. I'd give myself a strict 30-minute window to transition. I'd kick off my work shoes, change into sweatpants, and force myself to eat something. My diet consisted of things that could be prepared in under 10 minutes. Scrambled eggs, canned soup, and an ungodly amount of instant ramen. There were nights I was so tired I'd just eat a handful of almonds and call it dinner. Then I'd turn on my desk lamp, and the office of Grace Design Co. would officially open for business. This was where I came alive. The work was challenging and demanding, but it was mine. Every problem I solved, every client I satisfied was a small personal victory. I lived by the glow of my monitor, often until the first hints of dawn would begin to lighten the sky outside my window. Sleep became a luxury. 4 or 5 hours was a good night. My apartment, once my cozy sanctuary, became a cluttered command center. Sticky notes with project reminders covered my walls, and stacks of design books and sketch pads teetered precariously on every available surface. My first major turning point came about 6 months in. I was working with a woman named Sarah who was launching an organic skincare line. She was passionate and knowledgeable, but her budget was tiny. I, still operating from a place of fear and a desperate need for validation, quoted her a price that was barely enough to cover my time. We had a video call to discuss the initial designs, and she was thrilled with them. At the end of the call, she looked at me thoughtfully. "Grace, can I be honest with you?" she asked. "Your work is incredible, It's better than the mock-ups I got from a big agency that wanted to charge me 10 times what you are. You're selling yourself short. Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. A complete stranger saw more value in me than I was willing to claim for myself. The voice of my mother, of my family, was so deeply embedded in my subconscious that it was dictating my business practices. Don't get too big for your britches. Don't expect too much. Know your place. That night, I threw it all out. I created a new professional rate sheet, researching what top designers in my field were charging. My hands shook as I typed the numbers. They felt impossibly high. They felt arrogant. They felt like something Victoria would ask for. I almost deleted the file a dozen times, but Sarah's face kept appearing in my mind. The next morning, a request came in from a tech startup that needed a full branding package. I took a deep breath, attached my new rate sheet to the email, and hit send. I spent the rest of the day in an agony of suspense, convinced I had priced myself out of the market, that I had been foolish and greedy. That evening, a reply landed in my inbox. It was one sentence. The price is within our budget. When can you start? I had to read it 3 times before I believed it. That was the moment everything changed. With higher rates came better clients. More professional, more decisive, and more respectful of my time. My income exploded. The number in my secret savings account began to grow at a dizzying pace. Within 18 months, I had a 6-month waiting list for new projects. The workload was becoming impossible for one person to handle. I was terrified of burning out, of letting my quality slip. I knew I needed help. Hiring my first freelancer was even scarier than raising my rates. It meant trusting someone else with the business I had built from nothing. It meant being a boss. I posted a listing online and was inundated with applications. I spent a week poring over portfolios and another week conducting awkward Zoom interviews from my living room, trying to sound more confident and professional than I felt. I eventually hired 2 designers, Maria from Texas and Ben from Oregon. They were talented, hungry, and reliable. The first time I delegated a project to Maria and she delivered work that was just as good as, if not better than, my own, I felt a profound sense of relief. I wasn't alone in this anymore. Grace Design Co. was now a we. 3 years after that fateful Thanksgiving, I was consistently clearing more in a month from my business than I made in 6 months at my day job. The decision to quit was obvious, but it was still terrifying. Walking into my boss's office to hand in my resignation felt like stepping off a cliff. My steady, reliable paycheck had been my safety net for so long. Are you sure about this, Grace? He asked, genuinely concerned. A competitor can offer you more money, I understand. No, it's not that, I said, the words feeling wonderfully solid in my mouth. I'm going to be working for myself, full-time. The look on his face, a mixture of shock and admiration, was a satisfaction I had never known. All this time, my family remained completely in the dark. My Sunday calls with my mom became an exercise in careful omission. How are things, dear? She would ask, her voice laced with its usual pity. Things are good. Mom, keeping busy, I'd reply, staring at a signed contract on my desk worth more than my car. Well, don't work too hard at that little doodling job. Make sure you get out and have some fun, she'd advise. I will, I'd say, smiling to myself. The secret was no longer a shield against their judgment. It had become a private, beautiful world that was all my own, and I wasn't ready to let them in just yet. The idea of the house started as a vague dream, a distant point on the horizon. But as my business grew and my savings account swelled, the dream began to take on shape and weight. It became a concrete goal, the tangible culmination of every sleepless night and every sacrifice. It wasn't just about owning property. It was about building a sanctuary, a place of peace and stability that I had created for myself, on my own terms. It was about proving my mother's curse wrong. My house hunt began in secret, late at night. After a long day of client work, I'd trade my design software for real estate websites, my eyes bleary from staring at the screen. I scrolled through hundreds of listings, my search filters set exclusively to one town, Willow Creek. It was a choice born not out of a desire to imitate my sister, but out of a need to reclaim the narrative. My family saw Willow Creek as the exclusive domain of the successful, the stable, the real families like Victoria's. Buying a house there felt like planting my own flag on hostile territory. The first few houses I saw in person were disappointments. One was a modern new build with paper-thin walls and no soul. It felt cold and impersonal, too much like Victoria's showroom. Another was a small bungalow that was charming on the outside, but dark and cramped on the inside, making me feel claustrophobic. I was starting to feel discouraged, wondering if the perfect place only existed in my imagination. Then, one rainy Saturday morning, I had an appointment to see a brick colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street called Maple Drive. The moment I turned the corner, I felt it. A quiet little pull, a sense of rightness. The house wasn't ostentatious. It was solid, classic, and welcoming. It had dark green shutters that looked elegant against the weathered red brick, and a massive oak tree stood guard in the front yard, its branches spreading protectively over the roof. A small wooden swing hung on the porch. It looked like a house that had stories to tell. The realtor, Susan, was waiting for me at the door. She was impeccably dressed and had a bright, professional smile, but her eyes gave her away. She sized up my old sedan parked at the curb, my simple jeans and raincoat, and her smile became a little tighter, a little more condescending. She saw a young single woman who was probably just a curiosity seeker, not a serious buyer. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. Sunlight, muted by the rainy day, streamed through the large multi-paned windows, illuminating the rich patina of the original hardwood floors. The house had a gentle, peaceful energy. I walked slowly through the rooms, running my hand along the smooth, cool plaster walls and the carved wooden banister of the staircase. In the living room, a brick fireplace promised cozy winter nights. The kitchen was bright and airy, with a large window over the sink that looked out onto a lush, private backyard. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms. One was clearly the master, with 2 closets and its own small bathroom. I walked into the second bedroom and stopped. It had a large window that overlooked the backyard and got the best afternoon light. This, I thought instantly, would be my office, my headquarters, the place where I would continue to build my empire, but with a view of grass and trees instead of a brick wall. I could feel my future life taking shape within those walls. I could picture myself drinking coffee on the back steps, setting up a reading nook in the corner of the living room, and turning the third bedroom into a guest room, a welcoming space for my friends, the real family I had chosen for myself. We ended the tour back in the kitchen. Susan was leaning against the counter, looking at her watch. "So what do you think?" she asked, her tone polite but dismissive. "It's a wonderful property, gets a lot of traffic. The sellers have already received one offer." It was a classic sales tactic, designed to create a sense of urgency. "I love it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's perfect." Her professional smile snapped back into place. "Great. Well, the next step would be to get your financials in order. Getting pre-approved for a mortgage is key in this market. It shows the sellers you're a serious contender. I have a few mortgage brokers I work with who are excellent with first-time buyers. I can send you their information." She was already reaching for her phone, ready to move on to her next, more promising client. I let her talk, a small, secret smile playing on my lips. I enjoyed the moment, the dramatic irony of it all. She had no idea who she was talking to. She saw a daydreaming girl in a raincoat. She didn't see the CEO of a successful company who had spent the last 3 years planning for this exact moment. I waited for her to pause for breath. Then I said the words I had been practicing in my head for years. "That won't be necessary." She stopped, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. "I'm sorry? I don't need a mortgage broker," I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. "I'll pay cash." The change in her demeanor was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Her professional smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Her jaw literally dropped for a second before she snapped it shut. She straightened up from the counter, her body language shifting from dismissive to deeply respectful. You'll pay cash?" she stammered, her voice an octave higher than before. "For the full asking price?" "Yes," I said, feeling a surge of power so potent it almost made me dizzy. "And I'll offer $5,000 above asking to close the deal today." The rest of the process was a blur of paperwork and legal formalities. 2 weeks later, I sat in a sterile lawyer's office and signed my name on a thick stack of documents, each signature a final, definitive stroke in the masterpiece I was creating of my life. The lawyer slid a small velvet box across the polished mahogany table. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were 2 shiny brass keys. I drove straight to Maple Drive. The sold sign on the lawn now had a smaller sign hanging from it. Pending. I walked up the path and put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was my house. The silence was vast, a blank canvas. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare wood floors. I stood in the spot that would be my office, then in the living room where my fireplace would crackle. Finally, I went back to the living room and slid down the wall to sit on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I held the keys in my palm, their sharp edges digging reassuringly into my skin. They were real. This was all real, and I whispered to the empty, sunlit room, to the house that was all mine. "You did it, Grace. You did it." A wave of emotion I had been suppressing for years washed over me. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the hurt, the anger, and beneath it all, a deep, powerful current of pride. The tears that came were not just for this moment, but for every moment that had led to it. They were for the girl who won an art award and hid it in her car, for the young woman who was called a free spirit as an insult, and for the CEO who had built her company in secret. I sat there and cried until I had no tears left, the afternoon sun warming my face through the tall, beautiful windows of my brand new home. I waited a full year, a year of settling in, of turning my house into a home, a year of watching my business not just survive but flourish, a year of profound, uninterrupted peace. I bought furniture that I loved, painted the walls in colors that made me happy, and planted a garden in the backyard. My house was no longer an empty shell of potential. It was filled with life, with my life. And as Thanksgiving approached again, I knew it was time. I was no longer the ghost at the feast. I was a homeowner. I was a business owner. I was a woman who had built her own foundation, and it was time to stand on it. The drive to my parents' house was different this time. Last year I had been driving my old sputtering sedan, my stomach in knots, bracing myself for the inevitable onslaught of pity and condescension. This year I was behind the wheel of a new, reliable SUV I had bought with cash a few months prior. The heated leather seats were warm, the engine was a quiet hum, and my stomach was calm. I wasn't bracing for a fight. I was preparing for a quiet declaration of independence. I had dressed with intention, not in anything flashy, but in a simple, elegant cashmere sweater and well-fitting jeans. I felt solid, put together. I was wearing my calm-like armor. I parked on the street behind Victoria's gleaming black luxury SUV, a newer model than last year's. Some things, I mused, would never change. I took a deep, steadying breath before getting out of the car. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I walked up the familiar path and rang the doorbell. The same smells of roasted turkey and cinnamon wafted out to greet me when my dad opened the door. "Grace, you made it," he said, giving me a quick, awkward hug. His eyes flickered past me to my new car at the curb. He blinked, a flicker of surprise on his face, but said nothing. The scene inside was a perfect replica of the year before. My mom was bustling around the kitchen. My uncle was watching football on the television at a deafening volume, and Victoria was perched on a stool at the kitchen island, a glass of wine in her hand, holding court. She was in the middle of a story about her recent family vacation to a 5-star resort in Greece. "And the infinity pool, Mom, you would have died," she was saying, gesturing dramatically. It overlooked the Aegean Sea, and the kids had their own private butler. "Mark said we're absolutely going back next year." "Oh, how wonderful, Vicky," my mother gushed, pausing to beam at her. "You and Mark work so hard. You deserve to be pampered." She caught sight of me then. "Grace, hello, dear. You're late." "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice even. Traffic was heavy. It wasn't, but it was the kind of excuse they expected. The dinner conversation followed its predictable script. Victoria dominated, recounting every luxurious detail of her trip, every impressive accomplishment of her children, every new acquisition she and Mark had made. My parents and relatives hung on her every word, their faces a mixture of admiration and vicarious pride. I ate my turkey, I passed the gravy, and I remained silent, a quiet observer watching a play I'd seen 100 times before. I didn't feel the usual sting of invisibility. Instead, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were an anthropologist studying the peculiar customs of a foreign tribe. Finally, there was a lull in Victoria's monologue. My mother, as if remembering I was there, turned her attention to me. Her eyes did a quick, critical scan of my outfit before she plastered on a placid smile. "So, Grace," she began, her voice carrying across the table, "how are things? Still renting that little apartment downtown?" This was it. The moment, the cue I had been waiting for. The entire table quieted slightly, their attention shifting to me, ready for the familiar, pitiful chapter of the evening's performance. I took a slow sip of my water, set the glass down gently, and met my mother's gaze. "No," I said, my voice clear and calm. "I bought a house." The silence that fell over the table was instantaneous and absolute. It was so sudden and so complete that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. My uncle muted the football game. My dad, who had been mid-chew, froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. My mother blinked several times, as if she were trying to process a foreign language. "You what?" she asked, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. Victoria let out a short, sharp laugh, breaking the spell. The sound was brittle with disbelief. "Oh, please, Grace," she scoffed, swirling the wine in her glass. "Don't be so dramatic. A condo, maybe? Did you finally buy your little apartment?" The implication was clear. Even that would be a stretch. "No," I said again, my gaze unwavering. I turned my head slightly to look directly at her. A house. In Willow Creek. This second statement landed with the force of a physical shock. My dad actually set his fork down with a clatter. Victoria's condescending smirk faltered, replaced by a look of genuine, slack-jawed confusion. She knew what houses in Willow Creek cost. My mother found her voice first, and it was sharp with suspicion. Grace, that's not funny. You expect us to believe that you could afford a house in Willow Creek? On your salary? Don't lie at the dinner table. The accusation, the sheer impossibility of it in her mind, was exactly what I had expected. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my purse, took out my phone and unlocked it. I had saved a single photo on my lock screen for this exact occasion. It was a beautiful shot, taken just last week. The afternoon sun was hitting the front of my house, making the red brick glow. The dark green shutters looked crisp, and the porch swing was swaying gently in the breeze. A pot of bright yellow chrysanthemums sat on the steps. It looked like a picture from a magazine. It looked like a home. I placed the phone on the table and slid it silently across the polished wood toward the center. It stopped right in front of my father. He picked it up, his brow furrowed. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then his eyes widened. He looked up at me, then back at the picture, then back at me, his mouth slightly agape. My God, he whispered. He passed the phone to my mother. She snatched it from him. She stared at the screen, her face a blank mask of shock. I could see her zooming in, as if looking for evidence of a trick. She saw the address numbers on the door, clear as day. She saw my new car, the same one parked outside, sitting in the driveway. Her face paled. She didn't say a word, just passed the phone to Victoria as if it were contaminated. Victoria took the phone, her movements stiff. She looked at the picture, and her carefully constructed facade of smug superiority crumbled into dust. The smirk was gone, replaced by an ugly, twisted expression of envy and disbelief. She looked from the phone to me, her eyes narrowed. I let the silence stretch, letting the reality sink in. I picked up my wine glass, my hand perfectly steady. I took a slow sip, savoring the moment. Then I lowered the glass and looked at my mother, whose face was now a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. You said I'd never own a house like my sister, I said, my voice soft, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. You were right. I didn't. I paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the final quiet blow. I bought something better. I bought something that was mine. The silence that followed my statement was heavier and more suffocating than any that had come before. It was the sound of a 27-year-old narrative being utterly and completely shattered. The roles had been reversed so suddenly, so completely, that no one knew their lines anymore. I was no longer the struggling artist. Victoria was no longer the undisputed champion of success. The family hierarchy had imploded, and the quiet ringing in the air was the sound of the fallout. Victoria was the first to break. Her shock curdled into a bitter, defensive rage. She tossed my phone back onto the table as if it were a piece of garbage. Well, it must be nice, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. It must be nice to have no one to think about but yourself. No husband, no kids with tuition to pay. No real responsibilities. You can just squirrel away every penny you make from your little hobby. She started listing her burdens as if they were badges of honor. I have a mortgage on a 6-bedroom house, Grace. I have 2 children in a private academy. We have country club dues. That's what real adulthood looks like. It's not just about buying a cute little house for one. She was trying to diminish me, to reframe my monumental achievement as a frivolous indulgence, a result of a selfish, childless life. It was a desperate attempt to claw her way back to the top, to repaint me as irresponsible even in my success. A year ago, her words would have sliced me to the bone. Now they felt pathetic. They were the desperate flailings of a queen who had just been dethroned. My mother, seeing her golden child floundering, quickly scrambled to regain control. Her face hardened, her shock transforming into a mask of maternal indignation. You should have told us, Grace, she said, her voice sharp and accusatory. How could you do something so significant and not tell your own family? They're your parents. We could have helped you. Your father knows about real estate. We could have given you advice, made sure you weren't being taken advantage of. Her words were a masterclass in manipulation. She was twisting my independence into an act of betrayal. She was trying to reinsert herself into my narrative, not as a supporter, but as a gatekeeper of knowledge and wisdom whose counsel I had foolishly ignored. To keep a secret like that, she continued, her voice rising with manufactured hurt. It's like you don't even consider us your family. It's cruel, Grace. It's deeply, deeply cruel. She was painting herself as the victim, the mother, wounded by her secretive, ungrateful child. I looked at her, at the familiar patterns of her behavior, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of clarity. The old urge to defend myself, to justify my choices, was gone. I didn't need to. The proof of my competence was parked in a driveway in Willow Creek. I let her finish. Then I took a calm, steadying breath. I looked directly into her eyes, my gaze level and unblinking. "You already helped, Mom," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? We didn't help you do anything. You did," I insisted softly. "You helped me more than anyone." I paused, making sure I had her full, undivided attention. "You helped by doubting me. Every time you called my career a hobby, every time you looked at me with pity, every time you told me I wasn't enough, that's what lit the fire. You gave me the motivation no one else could." The truth of the words, delivered without anger or malice, was more devastating than any shout could have been. My mother's face stiffened as if I had slapped her. Her mouth opened, then closed again. There was no defense against it. Victoria, for her part, flinched and looked away, staring intently at a wine stain on the tablecloth. Even my dad, who had remained a silent observer, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time in my life, I held all the power at that table, and I knew in that moment that the best way to keep it was to walk away. I deliberately folded my napkin and placed it on the table. The small, neat gesture felt enormously significant. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs on the hardwood floor loud in the cavernous silence. I stood up. "Thank you for dinner, Mom," I said, my voice polite, detached. "It was delicious, as always." I walked around the table to where my grandmother was sitting. She looked up at me, her old eyes wide and filled with a complex mixture of shock and something that looked like awe. I leaned down and kissed her soft, wrinkled cheek. "I'll call you tomorrow, Grandma," I whispered. She squeezed my hand, a silent, powerful message of support. Then I turned to the rest of my stunned family. I looked at my mother, my father, my sister. "I have my own home-cooked dinner waiting for me at my house," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I just wanted you all to know where I live now. In case you ever want to visit." I paused and added the final, crucial boundary. "With respect." And then I turned and walked out of the dining room. I didn't run. I didn't storm out. I walked with a calm, measured pace down the hallway, retrieved my coat from the closet, and let myself out the front door, closing it softly behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes on my back. I could feel the entire foundation of their world cracking behind me. As I got into my car and started the engine, a feeling of profound, exhilarating lightness washed over me. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I had a voice. I had a home. And for the first time, I was driving towards it. The drive from my parents' house to mine was only 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey across a lifetime. The person who had arrived in their driveway 2 hours ago was not the same person who was now driving away. I drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek, the familiar landscape now feeling truly like it belonged to me. When I turned onto my street, the sight of my house, warm light spilling from the windows, a wreath on the dark green door, filled me with a sense of peace so deep it was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just a building I owned. It was my sanctuary. It was the fortress I had built brick by brick, pixel by pixel, secret by secret. I let myself in, the click of the lock sounding definitive in the quiet entryway. I hadn't actually cooked a Thanksgiving dinner, of course. The line had been a metaphor, a statement. My kitchen was clean and quiet. Instead of cooking, I filled the kettle with water and put it on the stove to boil for tea. While it heated, I walked through the rooms of my house, touching the furniture, running my hand along the cool plaster walls. In the living room, I lit a few candles. The soft, flickering light danced across the walls, making the space feel sacred. This room, where I had spent countless nights sketching out logos and wrestling with difficult clients, was now a haven of tranquility. The silence in the house was a stark contrast to the thick, suffocating silence I had left behind at my parents' dinner table. Their silence had been an absence of words, a void filled with shock and resentment. My silence was a presence. It was the sound of contentment, of safety, of a battle finally won. I made my tea and sat on the comfortable sofa I'd spent weeks searching for, curling my feet up under me. That's when my phone, which I had left on the kitchen counter, began to buzz. I ignored it. A minute later it buzzed again, and again. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The calls were an intrusion, an attempt to pull me back into the vortex of their drama. They were accustomed to me being available, to me absorbing their emotions and managing their expectations. That version of me was gone. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then, the text messages started. The screen lit up with previews. From Mom, "Grace, you can't just walk out like that. We need to talk about this." From Victoria, That was a cruel thing to do on Thanksgiving. From Mom again. Your father is very upset. Call me immediately. I read the messages with a sense of detachment. The words had no power over me here. Their attempts to guilt me, to frame me as the villain, were transparent and weak. They weren't upset that I had kept a secret. They were furious that I had stripped them of their power over me. I turned the phone over, screen down on the counter, and returned to my tea in the peaceful silence of my living room. Later that evening, another text came through. I glanced at it. It was from my dad. It was different from the others. Just 4 words. Proud of you, kiddo. I stared at the message for a long time. A part of me, the part that had craved his approval for my entire life, felt a warm flicker of validation, but it was followed by a wave of sadness. Why had it taken this? Why did I have to build a house and a 6-figure business to earn 4 simple words of pride from my own father? Why couldn't he have said them after my first art show? Or when I got my first job? Or when I paid off my student loans? The text was a crack in the facade, a tiny admission of his own failing, but it felt like too little, too late. It was a step, but I knew in my heart that it was a step he felt forced to take, not one he had chosen freely. I didn't reply to him either. Hours passed. The candles burned low. I read a book, listened to some quiet music. Around midnight, just as I was getting ready for bed, one more text lit up the screen. It was from Victoria. I shouldn't have laughed. Congratulations, Grace. This message was more complex. It was as close to an apology as my sister was capable of getting. There was no excuse, no justification, just a stark, simple admission. I could almost feel the effort it must have cost her to type those words, to humble herself even that much. I thought about our relationship, a long and painful history of competition I had never even known I was a part of. Her need to be the best, the brightest, had required me to be the least, the dimmest. My success hadn't just surprised her. It had fundamentally threatened her identity. Her text wasn't just an apology. It was a white flag, a tacit acknowledgement that the game was over. I thought about writing back, about saying thank you or it's okay, but the words felt hollow. It wasn't okay, and a simple thank you felt like I was letting her off the hook too easily. Some things didn't need a response. Some things just needed to be absorbed, to be allowed to settle. My silence was its own answer. It was a boundary. It said, I see your message, and I will accept it, but I am not going to rush to make you feel comfortable. You can sit with your own actions for a while. The days that followed were blissfully, strangely quiet. There were no more angry calls, no more manipulative texts. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie, calm stillness. I spent that weekend truly nesting. I went to a nursery and bought more plants for my garden. I went to a furniture store and finally ordered the large wooden dining table I'd been wanting, picturing it filled with my friends, with laughter, with joy. Each small act of building my home felt like an act of healing, of reinforcing the new reality I had created. I was no longer waiting for their permission to live, and the quiet from their end felt like a grudging acceptance of that fact. The shift had happened, the power had transferred, and it was all mine. Another year passed, and the quiet that had followed the Thanksgiving showdown slowly evolved into a new, fragile kind of normal. The angry, buzzing silence was replaced by hesitant, sporadic contact. A brief text from my dad asking what kind of lawnmower I'd bought. A stilted phone call from my mom on my birthday, where for the first time she didn't ask if I was managing okay, but instead asked what color I was thinking of painting the guest room. They were small, clumsy attempts at connection, like people learning a new language. They were learning to speak to the real Grace, not the ghost they had invented. Victoria and I had the least contact. The chasm between us was too wide, too filled with the wreckage of a lifetime of slights and jealousies. But the open hostility was gone, replaced by a sort of wary, distant truce. When the invitation for Thanksgiving arrived that year, I considered declining. The thought of walking back into that house, of sitting at that table, still produced a faint echo of the old anxiety. But I knew that not going would be an act of avoidance, of fear. I had won the war. I didn't need to keep fighting the battles. Showing up was a display of quiet confidence, proof that the old dynamics no longer had a hold on me. When I walked through the door, the difference in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Last year, the air had crackled with tension and disbelief. This year, it was thick with a heavy, awkward caution. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, afraid to say the wrong thing. Victoria was there, standing by the fireplace, and she looked smaller somehow, less radiant. She offered me a tight, brief smile and a quiet, "Hi, Grace." There was no smirk, no condescending once-over. Mom didn't mention that I was on time or late. She simply handed me a glass of water and asked if I needed anything. It was all excruciatingly polite and deeply strange. We sat down to dinner, and the conversation was stilted. My uncle tried to tell a joke that fell flat. My dad talked about the weather. Victoria spoke about her children's school play, but without the usual bragging, her words sounding hollow and rehearsed. It was clear that the family's old script had been thrown out, and no one had written a new one. I stayed quiet, not out of fear this time, but out of a calm sense of observation. It was my grandmother who finally broke the spell. She had been quieter than usual, watching everyone with her wise, knowing eyes. She turned to me, her voice clear and strong, deliberately drawing the entire table's attention. "Grace, dear," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "I watched that video tour of your home you sent me. It is just beautiful. The light in your office is simply wonderful." For the past year, my grandmother had been my one true ally. She had called me a week after the reveal, not to scold or question, but to ask for pictures. I had sent her a link to a video tour I'd made for my friends. She had called back weeping with pride. Her public validation now was a gift. It gave everyone else at the table permission to finally acknowledge my reality. "Thank you, Grandma," I smiled back. "It's a peaceful place. It's home." My father cleared his throat. "That oak tree in the front yard is a beauty. Grace, you'll want to make sure you have the branches trimmed back from the roof before winter." It was his way of offering a connection, of speaking to me as a fellow homeowner, an equal. "Thanks for the tip. Dad, I'll look into it," I said, and the simple, normal exchange felt both bizarre and deeply healing. Then, later, as I was helping to clear the plates, my mother cornered me in the kitchen. She was wringing a dish towel in her hands, her knuckles white. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Grace," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "About last year, She trailed off, struggling for the words. "I didn't mean to laugh at you," she finally managed, her gaze fixed on the sink. "It's just, I didn't think you could do it. I worried about you so much, about your choices. I never saw this." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was riddled with her own justifications and her own surprise. But it was the truth. She hadn't been intentionally cruel. She had simply suffered from a profound and crippling lack of imagination when it came to me. She could not envision a future for me that didn't align with her narrow definition of success. And that failure of imagination had been the source of so much of my pain. I looked at my mother, at this woman whose approval I had craved for so long, and I felt a wave of something that wasn't anger or even forgiveness, but a kind of gentle, sad acceptance. I had been waiting my whole life for her to see me, to believe in me, and I finally understood that it had been the wrong thing to wait for. Her belief was never a prerequisite for my success. I leaned against the counter and smiled, a real, gentle smile. "That's the thing, Mom," I said, and my voice was soft, devoid of any lingering bitterness. "You didn't have to think I could." I did. In that moment, I wasn't her child seeking validation anymore. I was a woman, whole and complete on her own. I was absolving her of a responsibility she had never been able to handle, the responsibility of believing in my dreams. They were my dreams, and as it turned out, my belief was the only one that had ever really mattered. She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with a complicated mix of regret and a new, hesitant flicker of pride. She didn't seem like a monster or a villain anymore. She just seemed like a woman who was finally seeing her daughter for the very first time. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't proving other people wrong. It's the quiet, unshakable peace of proving yourself right. I don't need their validation anymore. I don't need their applause or their approval to feel successful. The sound of my own key turning in my own lock, that's enough. Every creak of my wooden floorboards is a reminder of the foundation I built. Every sunrise that streams through my kitchen window as I make my morning coffee whispers the same simple, powerful message. You did this. My family visits now. Not often, and with a lingering awkwardness that may never fully disappear. But they come. My mother walks through my rooms, touching the things I've chosen with a quiet, curious respect. Victoria sits on my sofa and asks about my work, a genuine interest in her eyes that was never there before. They look around at the life I've built, at the home created from all the ambition they told me I never had. Owning a house isn't just about the walls and the roof and the deed with your name on it. It's about reclaiming your space in the world. It's about taking back every part of yourself they told you wasn't good enough, wasn't stable enough, wasn't worthy enough, and building a sanctuary out of it. They don't laugh at me anymore. They can't. I'm standing in a home that my doubt built, and from here, I can finally see myself clearly. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel.